Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but in the cutthroat world of the Lycan aristocracy, blood is merely a currency. Alara Ashford was traded for $2.3 million in a 15% stake in the Eastern silver mines. Her own sisters, blinded by greed and petty jealousy, signed the contract that condemned her to the most brutal alpha in the Northern Territories. They thought they were disposing of the family runt, discarding a useless burden to rot in the shadows of Montana. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the quiet, broken girl they sold for scraps was destined to wear the crown. She was the Alpha King's true mate. The girl with no wolf was the White Lycan, a creature not seen in North America for 300 years. This is the story of how the discarded became royalty, how the abused became the avenger, how silence became a roar that would shake the foundations of the Lycan world. The Ashford estate, once the proud heart of the Silver Ridge Pack in the deep forests of Oregon's Cascade Mountains, was decaying. The grand mahogany walls were peeling. The pack's treasury was entirely depleted down to the last copper penny. And Alpha Aldrich Ashford, 65 years old and ravaged by a mysterious wasting illness, was a shadow of the man he used to be. The sickness had stripped him of his authority, his strength, and his will to fight. The true power of the Silver Ridge Pack now rested in the manicured, ruthless hands of his two eldest daughters. Morgana Ashford, 28 years old, was a towering woman with ice blonde hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disdain. Her heart was colder than the winter storms that battered the Cascade Peaks. She paced the length of her father's study like a caged predator, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor with military precision. Serafina, her younger sister by 2 years, sat perched on the edge of their father's massive oak desk, filing her nails with an air of profound boredom. She wore a crimson silk blouse that cost more than most pack members earned in a month, purchased entirely on credit that was rapidly coming due. "The debt is due," Morgana stated, her voice slicing through the heavy, dust-filled air of the room like a blade through silk. "Alpha Ronan Ironwood has sent his final warning. By midnight tomorrow, he will either have his $2.3 million in restitution for the border skirmishes, or he will march his enforcers across our southern ridge and slaughter our remaining warriors. Every last one of them." Aldrich coughed weakly into a linen handkerchief, his chest rattling with the sound of fluid and failing organs. The handkerchief came away spotted with blood. "We cannot pay him, Morgana. You know the accounts are empty. We borrowed against the timber yields for the next 5 years just to keep the lights on. We will have to surrender the eastern logging territories, lose our only remaining source of income." Serafina scoffed, not bothering to look up from her nails. "Don't be pathetic, father. There is another way. Ronan doesn't just want land, he doesn't just want money, he wants submission. He wants a trophy to prove he brought the noble Ashfords to heel." "What are you suggesting?" Aldrich asked, though the tremor in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. He had known for days. He had simply been too much of a coward to acknowledge it. Morgana stopped pacing. She exchanged a dark, knowing look with Serafina, the kind of silent communication that only came from years of scheming together. "We give him Alara." Outside the heavy oak doors of the study, 20-year-old Alara Ashford froze. She had been carrying a tray of bitter herbal tea for her father, balancing it carefully on trembling hands. The thin cotton dress she wore, faded gray and 2 sizes too large, practically swallowed her fragile frame. Her bare feet were silent on the cold floorboards, calloused from years of walking without proper shoes. Alara was the anomaly of the Ashford bloodline. At 20 years old, she still had not shifted into her wolf. In a world where your worth was measured by the strength of your beast, where power was everything and weakness was despised, Alara had no power at all. Her sisters relentlessly mocked her, labeling her a defect, an omega born into an alpha's house through some cruel twist of fate. They treated her worse than the hired help. Far worse. She scrubbed floors until her knees bled. She served their meals while they ate and laughed and discussed her worthlessness as if she were not standing 3 feet away. She slept in a converted attic space with a single thin mattress and a window that let in the freezing mountain wind. While Morgana and Serafina paraded around in designer gowns bought on credit, they had no intention of repaying. Alara wore the same 3 dresses, rotated and patched until the fabric was nearly transparent. "Alara, your own sister," Aldrich's voice rasped with what might have been genuine shock breaking through his lethargy. "She is blood. She is a leech," Morgana snapped. The sound of her palm slamming down on the desk made Alara flinch in the hallway, and the teacup rattled on its saucer. "She hasn't shifted. She smells like a human. She acts like a human. She brings nothing but shame to this family. Every day she walks around this estate is another day the other packs look at us with pity." Serafina hopped off the desk, her voice taking on a sickeningly sweet tone as if she were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "Ronan sent a secondary term in his contract. Father, if we cannot provide the gold, he will accept an Ashford daughter as collateral." an indentured servant for his pack. He meant Morgana or me, obviously, to force a political marriage and complete humiliation. But the contract only specifies a daughter of the Ashford bloodline. It doesn't specify which one. The silence that followed was so complete that Alara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She could hear the crackle of the fireplace in the study. She could hear a mouse skittering somewhere in the walls. "He will kill her," Aldrich whispered, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, Alara thought she heard genuine anguish in his voice. Ronan Ironwood is a monster. His pack, the Ironwood Fortress, is a slaughterhouse. They call it that for a reason. If we send her there, she will not survive a month. "Better her than us," Serafina chimed in, and there was no sweetness in her voice now, only cold calculation. "Think about it, Father. If we send Alara, the debt is cleared. The Silver Ridge pack survives. Morgana and I can secure proper mates from wealthy packs in California or Colorado, and we can rebuild our fortune, our reputation." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was as sharp as broken glass. "If you don't do this, Ronan will kill us all anyway. His enforcers will burn this estate to the ground. They will rape and slaughter every female in our territory, every Omega, every elder, every child. What is the life of one defective girl against the survival of the entire pack?" Behind the door, a single tear slipped down Alara's cheek, splashing silently onto the wooden tray. The bitter tea rippled in concentric circles. She waited. She waited for her father to fight for her. She waited for the Alpha of Silver Ridge to roar in defense of his youngest child, to tell his cruel daughters that no amount of debt was worth selling his own blood. Instead, there was only a long, agonizing silence. Alara counted the seconds. 10, 20, 30. Each one felt like a stone dropping into the pit of her stomach. "Draw up the papers," Aldrich finally whispered. His voice was broken, defeated to the voice of a man who had already died inside. "Send a messenger to Ironwood territory. Tell Ronan the girl will be ready by nightfall tomorrow." Alara didn't scream. She didn't burst into the room to beg or plead or throw herself at her father's feet. Years of emotional abuse had taught her a brutal lesson. Pleading with her family was like screaming into a void. They didn't care. They had never cared. Numbly, she set the tray down on a side table in the hallway, the tea still steaming, untouched. She turned and fled down the grand staircase, her bare feet making no sound on the worn carpet runner. She needed to pack. She needed to run. She needed to do something, anything. But Morgana was always one step ahead. By the time Alara reached her small room in the attic, the heavy tread of combat boots was already echoing on the stairs below. 3 burly enforcers from the Silver Ridge Guard men who had known Alara since she was a baby stood in her doorway. Their faces were hard stripped of any pity or compassion. They had their orders. "Sorry, Miss Alara," the lead enforcer muttered. His name was Harrison, a scarred wolf with a jagged line running from his temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a territorial dispute 10 years ago. "Orders from Morgana. You're to be escorted to the extraction point immediately." "Please," Harrison, Alara whispered, backing away until her spine hit the cold glass of her single window. The evening light streaming through painted her in shades of amber and shadow. "You know what Ronan does to his captives. You've heard the stories. You can't let them do this to me." Harrison looked away, his jaw clenching. For a moment, just a moment, Alara thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe. Shame. But it died as quickly as it appeared. He signaled to the other 2 men. They grabbed Alara by the arms, their grips bruising and unforgiving. She kicked and struggled, her bare feet scrabbling against the floor, but she weighed barely 100 pounds. Malnutrition and years of inadequate food had left her weak. They dragged her from the room as if she weighed nothing at all, her protests echoing uselessly down the hallway. They hauled her out the back door of the estate, the one servants used, the one hidden from the main road. The harsh gravel of the driveway tore at her bare feet, drawing blood. She tried to dig her heels in, tried to make herself dead weight, but it was futile. Standing by a convoy of black armored SUVs, sleek and expensive and utterly out of place in rural Oregon, were her sisters. Morgana wore a triumphant smirk that twisted her beautiful features into something ugly. Serafina held a velvet folder in her manicured hands, the contract already signed and notarized, ready for delivery. Stepping out of the lead SUV was Alpha Ronan Ironwood himself. Ronan was a massive man, built like a brick wall, 6'5" and 290 pounds of pure muscle and malice. A jagged scar ran from his right temple down to his jawline, splitting his face into asymmetrical halves. His eyes, a cold, dead gray, locked onto Alara as Harrison and the others threw her into the dirt at his feet. She landed hard, the gravel biting into her palms and knees. "This is the tribute," Ronan sneered, nudging Alara's trembling shoulder with the steel toe of his boot. The impact sent a spike of pain through her collarbone. He looked up at Morgana with undisguised disgust. "She looks half-starved, and I smell no wolf on her. Did you try to cheat me?" Ashford Morgana stepped forward, her smile never wavering. She is an Ashford Alpha Ironwood, Aldrich's youngest daughter. The contract only required a blood daughter of the Ashford line. It said nothing about her capabilities. She will serve your pack well as an Omega, scrubbing your floors, serving your meals. A daily reminder to your people that the Ashfords bow to the Ironwood wolves. Ronan's cruel smile slowly spread across his scarred face. He understood immediately. The humiliation in the offering was exquisite. Very well, he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. And Ashford washing my boots. I suppose there is a certain poetry in that. He reached down, grabbing Alara by her hair and hauling her to her feet. She cried out in pain, tears springing to her eyes, but he ignored her completely. He tossed her toward his waiting men as if she were a sack of grain. Throw her into the back with the cargo, he ordered. If she tries to run, break her legs. She doesn't need to walk to scrub floors. The SUV doors slammed shut, plunging Alara into darkness. The last thing she saw through the tinted window was Morgana and Serafina turning their backs, walking calmly back to their decaying mansion. They didn't look back, not even once. They had successfully sold their own flesh and blood for a few more months of hollow luxury, and they felt nothing but relief. The drive from Oregon to Montana took 7 hours. Alara spent every minute of it in the cargo hold of the SUV, her wrists bound with zip ties, her ankles bound with rope. There were no seats back here, just hard metal and the smell of oil and exhaust. Every bump in the road sent her sliding across the floor. By the third hour, her shoulders were screaming from being wrenched at unnatural angles. By the fifth hour, she had stopped crying. The tears had simply run out. She tried to think, tried to plan, but what was there to plan? She had no wolf, no strength, no allies. She was being delivered to a man whose reputation for cruelty was legendary across the Northern Territories. The Ironwood Fortress was where disobedient wolves were sent to be broken. It was where Ronan trained his enforcers through brutal methods that most packs wouldn't dare employ. The voice in her head, the one she had heard since she was 7 years old, whispered faintly, "Patience, little one. Your time will come." Alara had never told anyone about the voice. When she was younger, she had tried to tell her father about it, but he had grown pale and afraid and told her to never speak of it again. The next day, he had started giving her daily vitamins, small blue pills that made her feel sluggish and disconnected. She had taken them obediently for 13 years, never questioning, because children in lichen families did not question their alphas. She didn't know that those pills contained trace amounts of wolfsbane, that her father had been systematically poisoning her since she was 7 years old to suppress the wolf inside her, to keep her weak, to keep her hidden, because Aldrich Ashford knew exactly what his youngest daughter was, and he had spent 20 years trying to bury that truth. The SUV finally came to a stop. Alara heard the crunch of gravel, the slamming of doors, the rough voices of men barking orders. The cargo hold door was wrenched open, and cold Montana air rushed in, carrying the smell of pine and smoke and something metallic. Blood, maybe. Rough hands grabbed her, hauled her out. Her legs had gone numb from being bound for 7 hours, and she collapsed the moment her feet touched the ground. Nobody helped her up. Someone kicked her in the ribs, not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to hurt. "Get up, defect." Alara forced herself to her knees, then to her feet. She swayed, her vision swimming with black spots. When her eyes finally focused, she saw it. The Ironwood Fortress. It was less of a pack settlement and more of a military compound. High steel fences topped with razor wire surrounded the entire territory, which sprawled across at least 8 acres. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by wolves with rifles. Concrete buildings, brutalist and ugly, squatted in neat rows. Smoke poured from the stacks of private refineries, casting everything in a perpetual gray haze. This was her new home. This was her hell. Ronan didn't waste time breaking her. The moment she was brought through the gates, she was stripped of her threadbare dress and given a coarse, scratchy gray uniform, the kind reserved for the lowest-ranking Omegas. The fabric felt like sandpaper against her skin. She was handed over to Marta, a vicious older woman, 58 years old, with a face like cured leather and eyes like chips of flint. Marta was the head of the domestic staff, and she took immense sadistic pleasure in working the former princess to the bone. "Welcome to Ironwood, girl," Marta said, her smile revealing yellow teeth. "You will wake at 4 in the morning. You will work until 10 at night. You will speak when spoken to and not one word otherwise. You will scrub every floor in the main hall until I can see my reflection. You will prepare 300 meals a day for the warriors, and if you fail at any of these tasks, you will be punished. Do you understand?" Alara nodded numbly. "I didn't hear you." "Yes, ma'am. Good." Marta shoved a bucket and a stiff bristled brush into Alara's hands. "Start with the kitchens. I want those floors spotless by dawn." And so began 8 months of systematic torture disguised as labor. Elara woke every morning at 4 a.m. to the sound of Marta's steel-toed boot kicking her thin mattress. She slept in a damp basement that she shared with 4 other Omegas, all of them just as broken and terrified as she was. The mattress was a 2-inch foam pad on bare concrete. There were no blankets. In the Montana winter, the temperature in the basement dropped to near freezing. Her hands, once soft, became covered in calluses within the first week. Burns from the industrial stoves followed in the second week. By the end of the first month, her hands were a roadmap of scars, chemical burns from the harsh cleaning solvents, cuts from broken glass and sharp metal edges. Her fingernails cracked and bled from scrubbing stone floors for 18 hours a day. The cleaning solvents were the worst. They smelled acidic and wrong, and they made her skin burn even through the thin rubber gloves she was given. What Elara didn't know was that those solvents were laced with liquid silver 0.03% concentration, just enough to be absorbed through the skin, just enough to suppress the wolf of any Omega who used them. Ronan wasn't taking any chances. He wanted his slaves to stay slaves. The pack warriors delighted in tormenting her. They knew who she was. Word had spread quickly that the pathetic girl scrubbing their floors was an Ashford, a daughter of a once noble bloodline, now reduced to servitude. They kicked her when she bent to pick up dropped silverware. They spat in her face when she served their meals. They called her names that made her want to curl up and die. Fallen princess on her knees where she belongs. Look at the defect trying to pretend she's people. I heard her own father sold her for pocket change. Elara learned to keep her eyes down, to move quickly and silently, to anticipate when a blow was coming and brace for it. She learned which warriors were merely cruel and which ones were genuinely dangerous. She learned to make herself as small and invisible as possible. But she never learned to stop hearing the voice in her head. The poison in your blood is fading, the voice whispered on cold nights when Elara was too exhausted to sleep. Soon, little one, soon you will be free. By the third month, Elara weighed 112 pounds down from 128 when she had arrived. By the fifth month, she was down to 104. By the eighth month, she was 98 pounds, her ribs visible through the thin gray uniform, her face gaunt and hollow. But something else was happening. Something Ronan and Marta couldn't see. Deep inside Alara's chest, beneath the layers of exhaustion and despair and chemical suppression, something was waking up. She began to feel a strange warmth on nights when the moon was full. Her vision would occasionally blur and shoved, showing her the world in high-contrast blacks and whites and silvers, the way a wolf saw. Sense became sharper. She could hear conversations happening 3 rooms away. Her wolf was clawing its way to the surface, fighting against 20 years of suppression and 8 months of silver poisoning, and it was getting stronger every day. One evening in late October, 8 months into her captivity, the entire Ironwood fortress was thrown into a frenzy of panicked preparation. Elara was on her hands and knees in the grand dining hall, polishing the heavy oak legs of the Alpha's table with a rag soaked in lemon oil when she heard Ronan shouting at his beta. The beta's name was Garrett, a ruthless man with a mechanical left eye from a fight that had gone wrong. He stood ramrod straight, arms behind his back, weathering Ronan's fury like a soldier under artillery fire. I don't care if the eastern border patrols are exhausted, Garrett. Double them. Triple them if you have to. Ronan was pacing frantically, a thin sheen of sweat on his scarred forehead, despite the cool autumn air. King Caspian's royal envoy just sent the missive. The king is conducting a provincial tour of the northern packs, and he will be here in 3 days. 3 days, Garrett. Do you understand what that means? Elara paused, her scrubbing her rag hovering over the wood. She had heard of King Caspian, of course. Every lichen in North America had heard of him. King Caspian Nightshade of the Obsidian Court was a legend that bordered on myth. He had ruled the entire North American lichen population for over a century, consolidating power through a combination of brutal efficiency and genuine, if harsh, justice. He was notoriously ruthless to corrupt alphas, and it was said that he could scent dishonesty from a mile away. He was an unmatched warrior who had single-handedly ended the lichen-vampire border wars decades ago, a conflict that had claimed tens of thousands of lives. But the most famous rumor about King Caspian was his curse. For 100 years, the Alpha King had searched for his true mate, traveling to every corner of the continent, every territory, every pack. He had scent-tested thousands upon thousands of females, from the highest-born nobles to the lowest-ranking Omegas, and found nothing. No spark, no bond, no connection. His patience, it was said, was wearing dangerously thin. And a king without a mate was a volatile, unpredictable force. 3 days is not enough time to hide all the unsavory elements of our operations. Garrett warned, his mechanical eye whirring as it focused on Ronan. The training pits still have bloodstains on the stones. The Omega quarters are a disaster, and the border patrols have been using excessive force on the smaller packs. If King Caspian investigates too closely, We hide what we must, Ronan snarled, cutting him off. We dress the females in silk for the banquet. We scrub the blood off the training grounds. We bury the bodies deeper. And we put on a show of absolute loyalty and prosperity. If King Caspian finds a reason to execute me, he will do it without hesitation. That man does not bluff. He paused, his cold gray eyes scanning the hall, and they landed on Alara beneath the table. She froze, her heart hammering. Ronan marched over, gripped her by the collar of her uniform, and hauled her out from under the table. She dangled in his grip, her feet barely touching the ground, choking on the fabric, digging into her throat. Especially this one, Ronan hissed, his foul breath washing over her face. His teeth were yellowed, and he smelled of whiskey and old meat. If the king finds out I bought an Ashford daughter as an indentured servant, he will view it as unsanctioned trafficking, a violation of the accords. You are to remain locked in the root cellar from the moment the king's motorcade breaches the gates until the moment he leaves. Do you understand me, girl? Yes, Alpha, Alara whispered, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to claw at his face, but she had learned long ago that fighting only made the punishments worse. Ronan dropped her carelessly. She hit the floor hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. He turned back to Garrett, already barking more orders, and Alara scrambled back to her bucket of lemon oil, her hands shaking. But as she dipped her rag back into the bucket, something happened. A strange sensation washed over her, starting at the base of her spine and radiating outward like heat from a fire. Her skin flushed, her vision blurred. For just a moment, the world shifted into that high-contrast wolf sight, sharper and more vivid than anything her human eyes could perceive. The voice in her head spoke louder and clearer than it had ever been before. He is coming. Our mate is coming. Alara's hands stilled. She looked down at her reflection in the polished wood of the table, and for just a fraction of a second, she could have sworn her eyes glowed silver. Her 21st birthday was exactly 3 days away. The age when a lichen scent fully matured. The age when the mate bond could activate. And somewhere 300 miles to the south, the Alpha King was already on his way. For the next 72 hours, the Ironwood Fortress transformed into a whirlwind of frantic preparation. Alara was worked harder than she had ever been worked in her life, and that was saying something. The entire compound had to be scrubbed, spotless, every surface gleaming, every corner free of dirt and blood, and the evidence of Ronan's cruelty. Marta drove the Omegas like a slave master with a whip, though she used her steel-toed boots instead. Faster, you useless creatures. The king's convoy could arrive at any moment. If there is so much as a speck of dust on these floors, I will personally flay the skin. From your backs, Alara hauled crate after crate of expensive wine from the storage cellars, bottles that cost more than she had ever seen in her life. She carried sides of beef that weighed nearly as much as she did her muscles screaming in protest. The industrial kitchen was a hellscape of heat and steam and shouting, and Alara was in the center of it all, invisible and disposable. But something was changing inside her. The burning sensation at the base of her spine grew stronger with each passing hour. Her vision continued to flicker between human sight and that strange heightened wolf perception. Colors became more vivid. Sounds became sharper. She could hear conversations happening 3 buildings away. She could smell the fear radiating off the other Omegas in waves. And beneath it all, she felt a pull. A magnetic drag in her very blood pointing south toward the road that led into Ironwood territory. Towards something. Towards someone. Day 1. 70 hours until the king's arrival. Alara was scrubbing the massive stone fireplace in the grand hall when her vision shifted without warning. The world went high contrast, blacks and whites and silvers, and suddenly she could see the individual fibers in the stone, the microscopic cracks and imperfections. She gasped, dropping her brush, and pressed her palms against her temples. What's wrong with you? Another Omega hissed from across the hall. A girl named Cassie, 19 years old, who had been trafficked from a pack in Idaho. Stop drawing attention to yourself. Alara forced herself to breathe slowly, deeply, and the vision flickered back to normal. I'm fine, she whispered. Just dizzy. But she wasn't fine. Her body was preparing for something. The wolf inside her, dormant for 20 years, suppressed by wolfsbane and malnutrition and silver lace cleaning chemicals, was fighting its way to the surface with a vengeance. Day 2. 46 hours until the king's arrival. Alara was hauling a crate of crystal goblets across the courtyard when the pain hit. It started at the base of her spine, a sharp stabbing sensation, like someone had driven a knife between her vertebrae. She stumbled, nearly dropping the crate, and had to grab onto a concrete pillar to stay upright. Her bones felt wrong, like they were shifting beneath her skin, realigning themselves into configurations they had never held before. Marta appeared out of nowhere, her face twisted with rage. Get up, useless runt! She drove her boot into Alara's ribs, not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. The king's banquet is tomorrow night, and you're wasting time, Alara forced herself upright, clutching the crate so tightly her knuckles went white. Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry, ma'am. But as she limped away, cradling her bruised ribs, something happened. Her eyes flashed. Just for half a second, they glowed brilliant celestial silver, bright enough that Marta actually took a step backward, her expression flickering with something that might have been fear. What was that? Marta demanded. Nothing, ma'am, Alara whispered, keeping her head down. The glow faded as quickly as it had appeared. Just the light. Marta stared at her for a long moment, suspicion written across her weathered face. Then she spat on the ground near Alara's feet and stalked away, muttering about defective omegas and cursed bloodlines. Alara didn't move until Marta was out of sight. Then she set the crate down carefully and looked at her hands. They were trembling, and for just a moment she could have sworn she saw a faint silver shimmer beneath her skin, like moonlight trapped in her veins. The voice in her head was no longer whispering. It was speaking clearly in full sentences, in a tone that was both hers and not hers. Patience, sister. He is almost here. Our true mate is almost here, and when he arrives, everything changes. Day 3, 22 hours until the king's arrival. The afternoon sky over Montana darkened with unnatural speed, thick clouds rolling in from the western mountains. The air grew heavy, oppressive, charged with a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. Alara was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes with hands that were blistered and bleeding, when every wolf in the compound suddenly went rigid. The pressure was crushing. It was like the atmosphere itself had gained weight, pressing down on every living thing within a 5-mile radius. Lower-ranking wolves dropped to their knees, gasping for air. Some of the weaker omegas collapsed entirely, their bodies simply giving out under the force of it. This was the aura of the Alpha King. This was the power of a wolf who had ruled for over a century, whose bloodline stretched back to the first lichens to walk the earth. And he was still miles away. Ronan burst into the kitchen, his face slick with sweat despite the cool air. His hands were shaking. Alara had never seen the brutal Alpha look afraid before, and the sight of it sent ice down her spine. Get her to the cellar, Ronan barked at Marta. Now, the king's motorcade just passed the southern checkpoint. He'll be at the gates in 30 minutes. Marta grabbed Alara by the arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. She didn't bother with words. She simply dragged Alara through the kitchen, past the other terrified omegas, toward the heavy iron door set into the floor at the back of the pantry. The root cellar. It was a subterranean storage space accessible only through a trapdoor and a steep stone staircase that descended into darkness. The cellar was used to store crates of rotting potatoes, sacks of flour, and sides of cured meat hanging from hooks in the ceiling. The air down there was freezing and damp, thick with the smell of mold and decay. Marta shoved Alara toward the open trapdoor. Down, now, please, Alara whispered, hating herself for begging, but unable to stop the words. Please don't lock me down there. I won't be seen. I'll hide in the basement with the others. Please. Marta's answering smile was cruel. You think I care what you want, defect? You're a liability. If the king finds out what you are, if he realizes Ronan bought an Alpha's daughter as a slave, we're all dead. So down you go. She gave Alara a hard shove. Alara stumbled, her foot catching on the edge of the trapdoor, and she fell. She tumbled down the stone steps, her body slamming against the hard edges, pain exploding in her shoulder, her hip, her knee. She landed at the bottom in a heap, the air knocked from her lungs. Above her, Marta stared down with pitiless eyes. If you make a sound, if you draw any attention to yourself, I will come down there and gut you myself. Do you understand? Alara couldn't answer. She could barely breathe. Marta slammed the heavy iron trapdoor shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Then came the definitive clack of a heavy steel padlock snapping into place. Darkness. Complete, absolute, suffocating darkness. Alara lay on the freezing dirt floor, surrounded by the smell of rot and mold, and tried not to scream. She was trapped, locked in a tomb while the most powerful wolf in North America arrived overhead. The irony was almost funny. Almost. She curled into a ball, her body shaking from cold and pain and fear. And then the real agony began. The shift. For 20 years, Alara's wolf had been suppressed, chained, buried so deep that she had almost convinced herself it didn't exist. But now, with the silver poisoning fading from her system, with her 21st birthday mere hours away, with the scent of her true mate somewhere above her, the wolf was done waiting. It clawed its way to the surface with a violence that tore a scream from Alara's throat. Her bones began to break and reform. Her spine elongated vertebrae, cracking and shifting like tectonic plates. Her fingers curled, nails lengthening into claws that scraped against the dirt floor. Her jaw ached, teeth shifting, canines growing longer and sharper. She had heard other wolves describe their first shift as painful but natural, like stretching a muscle that had been cramped too long. This was nothing like that. This was agony. This was her body tearing itself apart and rebuilding itself into something new, something that had been denied for far too long. Alara wept silently, curled on the floor of her prison, her tears mixing with the dirt and the blood from where her nails had dug into her palms. She was going to shift for the first time alone in the dark, trapped in a freezing cellar, while the world continued without her. Above her, she could hear the muffled sounds of organized chaos, heavy footsteps, shouting, the roar of engines, and beneath it all, that crushing pressure growing stronger and stronger as the Alpha King had approached. The voice in her head spoke, and this time it was not comforting. It was fierce, commanding, filled with a rage that had been building for 2 decades. He is here. Our mate is here, and you will not shift alone in this darkness. Hold on, sister. He is coming for us. Above ground, the ironwood fortress had gone completely silent. King Caspian Nightshade stepped out of his armored Bentley, and 200 wolves dropped to their knees as one. The pressure of his aura was so intense that the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat waves, like the atmosphere above asphalt on a summer day. Caspian stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders and a frame that spoke of both brutal strength and predatory grace. His hair was the color of midnight black, with hints of deep blue when the light caught it right. But it was his eyes that made people look away. They were violet. Not blue violet or gray violet, but true vivid impossible violet, like crushed amethyst or the sky at twilight. Those eyes swept over the kneeling pack with utter indifference, the gaze of a man who had seen this scene played out 10,000 times before and had long since stopped caring. He wore a tailored black suit that probably cost more than the entire ironwood fortress custom-made in Milan by a tailor who worked exclusively for royalty. The jacket fit perfectly across his shoulders, not a wrinkle or imperfection anywhere. At his throat was a silver pin in the shape of a crown, the symbol of the Obsidian Court. Beside him stood his beta, a man named Theron. Theron was 90 years old, though he looked perhaps 40, with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of face that had seen too many battles and survived them all through cunning rather than strength. He surveyed the ironwood wolves with tactical precision, his hand resting casually near the hilt of the silver blade at his waist. Alpha Ronan Ironwood. Caspian's voice was smooth deep and carried an inherent command that forced even the most dominant wolves to bare their necks in submission. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Stand. Ronan scrambled to his feet, his forehead still nearly touching the cobblestones. When he finally straightened, there was a fawning smile plastered across his scarred face that looked grotesque and desperate. Your Majesty, it is the highest honor to welcome you to Ironwood territory. We have prepared our finest banquet and our most comfortable quarters for you and your men. Please, if you will follow me. Caspian didn't smile. He stepped forward, his handmade Italian shoes clicking sharply against the stone courtyard. He inhaled deeply through his nose, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. His nose wrinkled. Just slightly. Your pack smells of fear and cheap iron, Ronan. Let us hope your banquet is more palatable than your hospitality. The tour of the compound was a tense, miserable affair for Ronan. Caspian was brutally observant. He noticed everything. The hastily concealed bloodstains near the training pits, still faintly visible despite the scrubbing. The terrified, bruised faces of the lower-ranking wolves that Ronan hadn't been quick enough to hide away. The way the Omegas flinched when anyone walked past them. Caspian said nothing. He asked no questions. He simply observed, his violet eyes missing nothing, and his silence was far more terrifying than any accusation could have been. By the time the evening banquet commenced in the grand hall, Ronan was sweating profusely despite the cool autumn air. He had seated Caspian at the head of the massive oak table, surrounded by the wealthiest and most beautiful females in the pack. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt at distraction. Ronan's own sister, a vain woman named Vivian, with platinum blonde hair and a dress cut so low it was practically obscene, draped herself over the arm of Caspian's chair. Your Majesty, she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. If the accommodations we've prepared are not to your liking, I would be more than happy to show you my personal quarters. They are much warmer, much more private. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Caspian slowly, deliberately turned his violet eyes toward Vivian. She was still smiling, but as his gaze locked onto hers, the smile began to falter. Then it crumbled entirely. She went pale, all the blood draining from her face as the weight of his attention fell on her like a physical thing. If you speak to me again, Caspian said softly, his voice a lethal purr that somehow carried to every corner of the dead silent hall, I will have your tongue removed. Do you understand? Vivian's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish drowning in air. She nodded frantically, scrambling backward, nearly tipping her chair over in her haste to get away from him. The other females at the table suddenly found their plates extremely interesting. Ronan choked on his wine, his eyes wide with terror. Your Majesty, I apologize for my sister's forwardness. She meant no disrespect. Caspian stood up abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the stone floor. The sound was jarring in the silence. He felt violently claustrophobic, surrounded by these pathetic, sycophantic wolves. He needed air. He needed to be anywhere but here. But as he placed his hands on the table to excuse himself, preparing to leave this miserable banquet early and damn the political consequences, something happened. A draft of cold air blew through the crack beneath the heavy wooden doors that led to the kitchens. It was barely noticeable, just a whisper of movement in the stagnant air of the hall. But carried on that draft was a scent. Caspian froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. His hands still resting on the table curled slowly into fists, his knuckles going white. The scent was faint, buried under layers of roasted meat and cheap wine, and Vivian's suffocating perfume. But it was there, and it was the most exquisite thing he had ever encountered in 130 years of existence. It smelled of blooming golden freesia, the kind that grew wild in the mountains during late spring. It smelled of wild honey, raw and unprocessed, straight from the comb. And beneath it all, crisp and clean and sharp, it smelled of a mountain thunderstorm, ozone and rain and electricity. Caspian's heart, which had beaten at a steady, indifferent rhythm for a century, suddenly slammed against his ribs like a sledgehammer. Once, twice, 3 times so hard it actually hurt. His inner wolf, the massive black beast that had been dormant and brooding for longer than he cared to remember, suddenly threw itself against the bars of his mind with a ferocity that made Caspian stagger. The wolf roared a sound that existed only in his head, but felt like it could shatter mountains. Mate, ours, find her now. Caspian's eyes flashed brilliant, glowing violets so bright they lit up the dim hall like twin stars. Theron, who had been standing at parade rest near the doorway, immediately stepped forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of his blade. Caspian, he said quietly, urgently. What is it? What's wrong? Caspian didn't answer. He couldn't answer. His entire world had narrowed to a single point: that scent. That impossible, perfect, intoxicating scent. The scent of the mate he had been searching for across 6 continents in 100 years. She was here. She was close. And she was in pain. He could smell blood mixed with the freesia and honey. He could smell fear. He could smell the desperate, agonized pheromones of someone in the throes of a forced, unguided shift. Caspian vaulted over the grand table in one fluid motion, his superhuman strength sending plates and crystal goblets flying. They shattered against the stone floor in an explosion of porcelain and glass. The Ironwood Pack members screamed and scattered, pressing themselves against the walls in sheer terror as the Alpha King stalked toward the kitchen doors like a predator who had just caught the scent of wounded prey. Ronan ran after him, his face ashen, his hands shaking. Your Majesty, please, the kitchens are filthy. You shouldn't. Caspian didn't even break stride. He hit the heavy swinging kitchen doors with his shoulder, and they blew off their hinges with a deafening crash of splintering wood and twisted metal. The doors flew across the kitchen and slammed into the far wall, embedding themselves in the plaster. The kitchen staff shrieked, dropping pots and pans, scrambling to get out of his way. Caspian stood in the center of the industrial kitchen, his chest heaving, and closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, pulling the scent into his lungs, letting it fill every part of him. It was stronger here, much stronger. The freesia and honey and storm were almost overwhelming, wrapping around his senses like silk, pulling him forward. He tracked it with lethal precision, his feet moving of their own accord, following the invisible thread that connected him to his mate. He stalked past the terrified staff, past the industrial ovens that radiated heat like small suns, past the pantry shelves stocked with supplies. He stopped in front of a heavy iron trapdoor set into the floor at the back of the pantry. The scent was pouring through the cracks of the door, mixed with the sharp metallic tang of blood and the desperate pheromones of someone in immense pain, of someone shifting, of someone trapped and alone and terrified. The sound that came out of Caspian's throat was not human. It was a growl, low and resonant, and filled with a rage that could level cities. His eyes blazed brilliant violet, glowing so brightly that they cast shadows on the walls. Open it, he said. His voice dropped into a demonic dual-toned octave that vibrated the very foundation of the building. It was the voice of his wolf, speaking in tandem with his human consciousness, both of them demanding the same thing. Ronan, who had finally caught up, took one look at the cellar door and felt every drop of blood drain from his face. His bladder let go a warm wetness spreading down his leg, but he was too terrified to even feel shame. Your Majesty, please, that's just the root cellar. There's a rat infestation. We locked it to keep the vermin contained. Caspian moved faster than the human eye could track. One moment he was standing 5 feet away. The next his hand was wrapped around Ronan's throat, lifting the massive 300-pound alpha off the floor with one arm, as if he weighed nothing at all. Caspian's claws extended 5 curved blades of bone and fury, and they pierced the skin of Ronan's neck, drawing beads of blood that ran down to stain his expensive shirt collar. If my mate is behind this door, Caspian whispered, his voice soft and terrible, and filled with the promise of apocalyptic violence, and she is hurt, I will burn your entire territory to ash. I will slaughter every wolf in this compound. I will make you watch as I kill everyone you have ever cared about. And then I will make you eat the cinders of their bones before I allow you to die. Give me the key. Ronan clawed uselessly at Caspian's wrist, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging. I'm Marta, the old woman, she has it. Caspian dropped him. Ronan hit the floor like a sack of wet cement, gasping and choking, clutching his bleeding throat. But Caspian didn't wait for Marta. He didn't wait for keys. He wrapped both hands around the heavy steel padlock, securing the trapdoor, his muscles bulging beneath the fine fabric of his suit. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a sickening groan of metal under impossible strain, a sound like a scream, and the padlock simply ripped apart in his hands. The shackle tore free of the lock body with a shriek of tortured steel. He threw the ruined lock aside and wrenched the heavy iron trapdoor open. It weighed over 200 pounds, but he flung it back as if it were made of cardboard. The door crashed against the floor with a sound like thunder. Cold, damp air rushed up from the darkness below, carrying with it that scent, that perfect, maddening scent of freesia and honey and coming storms. Bring light, Caspian commanded, not looking back. Theron grabbed a heavy flashlight from a wall mount and followed his king down into the depths, his other hand never leaving his blade. At the bottom of the stone stairs, surrounded by overturned crates of rotting vegetables and hanging sides of cured meat, Caspian found her. Elara was curled on the damp dirt floor, her body convulsing in the throes of a forced, unguided transition. Her skin was burning with fever, slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature. Her bones were shifting and snapping in agonizing intervals, her spine arching at angles that should have been impossible. She was weeping silently, her hands gripping her hair so tightly that strands were coming loose. She looked so small, so broken. Her gray uniform hung off her malnourished frame, torn and filthy. Her bare feet were bloody and bruised. Her face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, the face of someone who had been systematically starved. But as Caspian stepped toward her, as the beam of Theron's flashlight illuminated the dark corner of the cellar, something changed. The convulsions stopped. Just like that. The agonizing pain that had been tearing through Elara's body receded like a tide pulling back from the shore. It didn't disappear entirely, but it became manageable, bearable. She felt a wave of warmth wash over her, replacing the freezing cold. She felt safe. For the first time in 8 months, for the first time in 20 years, she felt completely, utterly safe. Slowly, carefully, Elara uncurled. She lifted her dirt-streaked face, blinking against the light. Through the blur of her tears and the dim flashlight beam, she saw him. A man dressed in midnight black that made him look like a piece of the darkness given form. And his eyes, violet, glowing, fixed on her as if she were the only thing that existed in the entire universe. Caspian dropped to his knees in the dirt, heedless of his $10,000 suit. His hands, large and trembling, with a century of suppressed emotion, reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't pull away. His fingers touched her cheeks, cupping her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible, from hands that had just torn steel apart. The moment his skin made contact with hers, a shockwave of pure electricity exploded between them. It was visible, a flash of gold-white light that illuminated the entire cellar for a fraction of a second. The mate bond, dormant for both of them for so long, sealed with an audible snap that resonated in their very souls. Mine, Caspian breathed. His voice broke, cracking with 100 years of loneliness, of searching, of hoping, and being disappointed and hoping again anyway. Mine. You're mine. He gathered her tiny, fragile body into his massive arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. She was so light. 98 pounds of bone and skin and untapped power. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling deeply, and the scent of freesia and honey and storm filled his lungs and made him feel drunk, intoxicated, complete. Elara, exhausted beyond measure, abused beyond comprehension, and thoroughly bewildered by this sudden change in her fortunes, simply rested her head against the broad expanse of his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady and eternal. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she closed her eyes and felt no fear. Above them, at the top of the stairs, Ronan Ironwood stood looking down into the cellar. He watched the Alpha King cradle the broken Omega in his arms. He watched the golden light of the mate bond still flickering faintly around them like dying embers. And he realized with a sinking, horrifying certainty that he had just signed his own death warrant, Yitamarant. He had enslaved the Alpha Queen. The grand hall had transformed from a banquet into a courtroom. Every wolf present stood frozen, their eyes locked on the shattered kitchen doors. When King Caspian emerged from the shadows, his midnight suit jacket wrapped around the fragile bundle in his arms, the collective gasp sucked oxygen from the air. He was transformed. Cellar dirt streaked his white shirt. His violet eyes blazed with unrestrained fury, glowing like twin stars in the dim hall. Cradled against his chest was Alara, her face buried in his neck, her bruised fingers clutching his shirt as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. To the Ironwood pack, she was the nameless Ashford Runt, the defective Omega they had kicked and starved for 8 months. To the king, she was everything. Ronan stumbled into the hall behind them, his face ash-white, his collar stained with blood from Caspian's claws. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. Caspian's voice when he spoke was a low purr that vibrated through the floorboards. Beta Theron. Theron stepped forward, hand on his blade. Yes, your majesty. Seal the compound. No one leaves. Cut communications. Lock down the airspace. It is already done, sire. Theron motioned and heavily armed royal guards flooded the hall's perimeter, emerging from shadows like wraiths. Red targeting lasers painted dozens of dots across ironwood chests. The pack had been surrounded without realizing it. Ronan fell to his knees, the sound loud in the silence. Your Majesty, King Caspian, please, I swear I did not know she was your mate. Caspian's glowing eyes slowly turned toward the kneeling Alpha. He didn't speak. His silence was a weapon. She was sold to me, Ronan pleaded desperately, by her own family, the Ashfords of Silver Ridge in Oregon. I have the contract, the signatures. She's a defect, an unshifted Omega. How could I have possibly known Caspian moved with inhuman speed? He didn't drop Alara. A concussive wave of alpha aura slammed into Ronan like a physical blow. Ronan was lifted off his knees and thrown backward through a heavy oak table. 3 inches of solid wood splintered like kindling. He screamed as atmospheric pressure pinned him to the stone floor. His collarbone snapped with an audible crack. Caspian walked slowly toward the broken man, each footstep echoing like a judge's gavel. Alara whimpered softly, and the moment he heard it, Caspian's expression shifted. The rage was leashed immediately. He pulled back his aura until weaker wolves could breathe again. His free hand gently stroked Alara's tangled hair. Shh, little one, he whispered against her temple. His voice, cold enough to freeze oceans moments ago, was now warm and soft. You are safe. No one in this room will ever lay a hand on you again. I promise you this. Alara's fingers tightened on his shirt. She kept her face buried against him, shutting out the world. Caspian turned his glowing eyes back to Ronan. You chained my queen in a freezing cellar. You starved her until she weighed less than 100 pounds. You worked her until her hands bled. You poisoned her with silver-laced chemicals to suppress her wolf. You allowed your people to kick her, to spit on her, to treat her as less than nothing. It was Marta. Ronan sobbed. He pointed a trembling, bloody finger toward the kitchen staff huddled in the corner. Marta oversaw the Omegas. She had the key to the cellar. Marta, the vicious head of domestic staff, shrieked and tried to run. She didn't make it 3 steps. 2 royal guards materialized in her path. One swept her legs out. She hit the floor hard, her face slamming into stone with a crack suggesting broken teeth. Silver handcuffs locked around her wrists. The metal burned her skin on contact. She screamed, thrashing uselessly. Caspian looked down at Ronan with absolute freezing disgust. A true alpha takes responsibility for his territory, for every wolf under his protection, and for every crime committed within his borders. You blame your subordinates for the rot in your own house. You are a coward, Ronan Ironwood. And that is the worst thing an alpha can be. He raised his free hand, addressing the terrified pack. His voice carried to every corner. Hear now the judgment of the Obsidian Crown. The room held his collective breath. As of this moment, the Ironwood pack is dissolved. Ronan Ironwood is stripped of his title, his lands, his wealth, and every privilege afforded to an alpha. He is declared rogue. He will be transported to the subterranean prison at Blackgate Penitentiary to await trial and execution for high treason, for unsanctioned trafficking, in violation of the Lycan Accords, and for crimes against the crown. A wail went up. Vivian, Ronan's sister, was on her knees, mascara running in black rivers. A sharp glare from Theron silenced her. She collapsed forward, sobbing into the floor. Furthermore, Caspian continued, his voice ringing like a funeral bell. This territory is now under royal occupation. Every asset, every building, every piece of land is seized in the name of the Obsidian Court. Any wolf who participated in the abuse of my mate will be subjected to the crown's justice. You will be investigated. You will be questioned. And if you are found guilty, you will be punished. He turned to Theron. Tear this place apart. Find the contract Ronan spoke of. I want to see exactly whose signatures sold my mate into slavery. I want names, addresses, every detail. Yes, your majesty. Theron bowed, then gestured to royal operatives who dispersed with military precision. Caspian turned away from the wreckage of Ironwood leadership as if they were already dead and forgotten. He looked down at Alara, who had exhausted her tears and was slipping into unconsciousness. Her body was depleted from the interrupted transition from 8 months of abuse, from the sudden, overwhelming release of adrenaline when the mate bond had sealed. "We are leaving," Caspian announced, his tone brooking no argument. He adjusted her weight so her head rested more comfortably against his shoulder. He carried her toward the massive entrance doors, stepping over Ronan's broken form without sparing him another glance. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, pressing themselves against walls, heads bowed in submission or terror, or both. Caspian stepped through the threshold of Alara's hell and out into cool, crisp mountain air. Above them, the Montana sky was clear and filled with stars, the moon hanging full and bright like a silver coin against black velvet. Within minutes, the heavy thwack, thwack, thwack of rotor blades echoed through the valley. A military-grade Sikorsky helicopter descended from darkness, searchlights painting the compound in harsh white light. It touched down with surgical precision, downdraft sending dust and debris swirling. Caspian boarded with Alara still cradled in his arms. He settled into the leather seat, refusing to let even the royal medics touch her yet. She was his responsibility, his mate, and he would be damned if he let her out of his sight before she was safe in his own territory. The helicopter lifted off, banking south toward the sanctuary of the Obsidian Keep in Colorado. As they gained altitude, Caspian looked down at the shrinking ironwood fortress. From this height, it looked small, insignificant, a blight that would soon be cleansed and repurposed. The immediate threat was neutralized. Ronan was in custody, the pack was dissolved, but a colder, darker rage was brewing in Caspian's chest, settling like ice in his veins. Ronan was only the buyer. The symptom, not the disease. The true architects of Alara's misery were still out there, living comfortably in the lush forests of Oregon, drinking expensive wine and wearing expensive clothes purchased with the $2.3 million they had received in exchange for their own blood. The Ashfords were going to learn a very painful lesson about the cost of selling their own daughter, and Caspian was going to be the one to teach it to them. The Obsidian Keep was a marvel of modern architecture, fused seamlessly with ancient lichen tradition. Nestled in a heavily guarded private valley, deep within the San Juan Mountains near Telluride, Colorado, the estate sprawled across 200 acres of pristine wilderness. The main structure was a fortress of glass, black marble, and warm timber built into the mountainside itself. It overlooked a pristine alpine lake so clear, you could see stones at the bottom 40 feet down. The journey back to consciousness was slow. Alara drifted in and out of awareness for 3 days, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had fought for 8 months. She dreamed of darkness and cold, then warmth and safety. She dreamed of violet eyes and a voice that promised she would never be heard again. When she finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was light. Not the harsh glare of a bare bulb, not the freezing dampness of a basement. Soft golden morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was massive, bathed in sunlight. A fire crackled gently in a stone hearth, large enough to stand inside. The ceiling was vaulted exposed timber beams supporting the structure. Thick rugs covered polished hardwood. The furniture was heavy, dark, expensive looking. And sitting in a leather armchair beside the bed, watching her with eyes that reflected the firelight, was the king. Alara flinched violently, scrambling backward until her spine hit the velvet headboard. She pulled the covers to her chin, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. Caspian had discarded his formal suit. He wore simple, dark trousers and a charcoal Henley that clung to his muscled frame. His midnight hair was slightly tousled. Dark circles under his violet eyes suggested he hadn't slept well, or perhaps at all. But the moment he saw her panic, he immediately raised both hands slowly, palms open. The gesture was careful, deliberate. "I apologize," Caspian said softly. His voice was carefully modulated to a gentle, non-threatening octave. "I did not mean to startle you. My name is Caspian. Caspian Nightshade." Alara stared at him, her mind racing. She remembered the cellar, the pain of the shift, the moment it stopped, replaced by warmth and safety. Violet eyes and strong arms and a voice that promised she was safe. "You're the king," she whispered. Her voice came out hoarse and cracked her throat dry as sandpaper. "To the world, yes," Caspian replied. He leaned forward, slightly resting his elbows on his knees, making himself smaller, less imposing. "To you, I am simply your mate." The word hung in the air. Mate. The most sacred bond in lichen culture. The connection that supposedly transcended everything else. Alara swallowed hard, her throat clicking. "That's impossible." Her voice broke. "I'm nothing. I'm a defect. I'm an unshifted omega. The Alpha King doesn't mate with defective runts. My sisters told me. They told me every day for 20 years. They said the moon goddess cursed me for being worthless." A flash of absolute fury crossed Caspian's face, making his eyes flare brighter. His jaw clenched. But he quickly closed his eyes and took a deep, measured breath, visibly forcing himself to calm down. When he opened his eyes again, the anger was gone, replaced by profound, heartbreaking tenderness. Your sisters are fools, Caspian said quietly. He stood up slowly, telegraphing his movements. He moved to a silver tray on a side table where a crystal pitcher of water stood sweating with condensation. He poured a glass carefully and brought it to her. He didn't force her to take it. He simply set it on the nightstand within easy reach, then stepped back. You are not cursed, Alara. You are not defective. You are a late bloomer, yes, but not because you are weak. Dr. Elena, my chief medical officer, examined you while you slept. She found trace amounts of wolfsbane in your system, consistent with long-term exposure starting in childhood. Someone was poisoning you, suppressing your wolf deliberately. Alara's hand slowly reached for the water glass. It trembled as she brought it to her lips. The water was cold and clean and tasted like it had come straight from a mountain spring. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She drank half the glass before lowering it, her hands still shaking. The blue pills, she whispered more to herself than to him. The memory came back suddenly, crystal clear. My father gave me blue pills every day, starting when I was 7. He said they were vitamins. He said they would keep me healthy. Caspian's expression darkened, but he kept his voice gentle. Wolfsbane, he confirmed. Combined with the severe malnutrition and psychological trauma your family inflicted, your wolf was buried deep, fighting just to keep your human body alive. And then at Ironwood, the silver-laced cleaning chemicals you were forced to use completed the suppression. He paused. But your wolf was never gone, Alara. I felt her when I found you. She is there. She is strong. She is magnificent. And she is finally free. Tears pricked at Alara's eyes. For her entire life, she had been told she was nothing. A burden. A stain on the proud Ashford name. A mistake the moon goddess regretted making. Now the most powerful lichen in the world was standing in front of her, looking at her with absolute reverence, telling her she was magnificent. Why me? The words came out as barely more than a whisper. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Why would the moon goddess give you someone like me? You deserve a queen who is strong and beautiful and worthy, not a broken slave. Caspian moved then, unable to stop himself. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful to keep a respectful distance. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and his large, warm fingers gently wiped the tear from her face. The moment his skin touched hers, the electric spark of the mate bond danced across their skin like static electricity, visible as tiny threads of gold-white light. The sensation sent a shiver down Alara's spine that had nothing to do with cold or fear, and everything to do with the rightness of it. Because the moon goddess knew I needed a queen with a heart strong enough to survive the dark, Caspian murmured. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with exquisite gentleness. And because she knew you needed a sanctuary, a place where you would never be hurt again. His violet eyes locked onto hers, and the intensity in them stole her breath. You will never scrub another floor, Alara. You will never be cold or hungry or frightened again. You will never be struck or kicked or told you are worthless. That is my vow to you, and I have never broken a vow in 130 years of life. I do not intend to start now. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Alara believed someone. She believed him. And she let herself cry not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being safe. Caspian pulled her gently into his arms, and she didn't resist. She buried her face against his chest and wept while he held her, one hand stroking her hair, the other wrapped protectively around her fragile frame. He didn't shush her or tell her to stop. He simply held her and let her cry out 8 months of horror and 20 years of abuse until she had nothing left. When the tears finally subsided, when she was empty and exhausted and wrung out, Alara pulled back just enough to look up at him. What happens now? She asked quietly. Caspian's smile was small but genuine, and it transformed his face from terrifyingly beautiful to something softer. Now you heal. You rest. You eat. You grow strong. He stood, offering his hand. And when you are ready, there is something I want to show you. Alara took his hand, letting him guide her to the massive windows. Below, the alpine lakes shimmered silver under the afternoon sun. The San Juan peaks stretched endlessly, snow-capped and pristine. This is your home now, Caspian said quietly. The Obsidian Keep. 200 acres where you will never know fear again. Alara's breath caught. Home. She had never had a home, only prisons with different names. But first, Caspian continued, his voice dropping to something almost tender. You need to meet her. Meet who? His violet eyes met hers. Your wolf. 2 weeks later, the full moon rose over the Obsidian Keep. Alara stood on the private balcony of her suite, Caspian beside her. The past 14 days had been a revelation. Under Dr. Elena's care and the nutrient-rich meals of the royal kitchens, her body had begun to heal. She had gained 14 pounds. The bruises had faded to yellow shadows. The chemical burns on her hands were smooth pink scars now, but the most profound change was happening inside her. Without the wolfsbane, without the silver poisoning, without the constant terror, the dormant predator within her was waking with a vengeance. "Do you feel it?" Caspian asked softly. Alara nodded. The burning at the base of her spine had grown from a whisper to a roar. Her senses were sharper. She could hear the guards patrolling 200 yards away. She could smell the pine sap on the wind. And beneath it all, she felt her wolf patient and powerful, waiting to be unleashed. "I'm afraid," she whispered. Caspian's hand found hers. "Fear is natural, but you are not alone. And this time the shift will not be agony. This time it will be freedom." The moon crested the peaks full and brilliant, and Alara felt the pull in her very bones. It started at her spine, but this time there was no pain. Her bones didn't break, they flowed. Vertebrae elongated seamlessly, her frame expanding with fluid grace. Her fingers lengthened, nails becoming claws, not through tearing, but through transformation. Her senses exploded outward in a cascade of scents and sounds and textures she had never imagined. And then she was standing on four legs, her body reformed into something magnificent. Caspian dropped to one knee, his head bowed in reverence. Alara looked down at herself, and her breath caught. Her fur was pure white, so bright it seemed to glow with its own internal light under the moon. Not cream, not ivory, pure white like fresh snow, like starlight given form. She was massive, taller than any alpha she had ever seen, standing nearly 5 feet 8 inches at the shoulder. Her paws were the size of dinner plates. And when she caught her reflection in the glass doors, she saw her eyes glowing celestial silver, bright as molten mercury. This was the white lichen, the creature not seen in North America for 300 years, the wolf of legend. From the shadows of the suite, Caspian's own wolf emerged, a massive black beast 6 feet 2 inches at the shoulder, the size of a grizzly bear. His fur was midnight black, his eyes burning violet. He approached her slowly, submissively, and nuzzled his massive head under her chin, the Alpha King bowing to his queen. Alara threw her head back and howled. The sound was melodic, haunting, beautiful. It echoed off the mountain peaks and carried for miles a declaration to the world that the white lichen had returned. And across the valley, wolves from the Obsidian Keep answered, their voices joining hers in a symphony of recognition. The age of hiding was over. Over the next month, Alara discovered what she was truly capable of. Lyra, the lead warrior of the Obsidian Guard, a woman of 35 with scarred arms and a tactical mind, trained her in combat. Alara's white lichen reflexes were supernatural. She could disarm 3 attackers in 8 seconds, move faster than the human eye could track. What took normal wolves years to master, she learned in days. Theron taught her politics and law. She absorbed lichen history, territorial treaties, the intricate web of pack alliances. Her mind, freed from the fog of starvation and abuse, was sharp as a blade. But it was Caspian who taught her the most important lesson. "Your aura," he explained one evening by the fire, "is different from mine. I dominate through overwhelming force. You calm through serene power. Where I make wolves submit, you make them want to follow." He was right. When Alara walked through, the keep warriors who would normally challenge any authority instinctively stepped aside and bowed their heads. Not from fear, from respect. She was becoming a queen. But in the quiet moments when she was alone with Caspian by the fire, she was still just Alara. Healing, learning to trust, learning that not all touch brought pain, and planning, because Theron had found the contract. All 3 Ashford signatures, black ink on cream parchment. $2.3 million and 15% of the Eastern silver mines. The price tag on her suffering. When Alara asked Caspian one night, 4 weeks after her rescue, he didn't need clarification. "The coronation gala is scheduled for late January. Every regional alpha will attend, including the Ashfords. They don't know it's me. No, the invitation simply says, the White Lichen Queen. They'll come expecting to network to secure alliances." Alara's silver eyes glowed in the firelight. "And instead, they'll face judgment." Caspian's smile was cold and satisfied. "Justice, little one. What they'll face is justice." 4 weeks before the gala, formal invitations were sent to all regional alphas. The letter to the Ashfords was delivered by royal courier on thick cream parchment bearing the obsidian seal. In the decaying Silver Ridge manor, Morgana ripped open the envelope with manicured nails. "Well?" Serafina asked impatiently from the sofa, sipping cheap champagne. Morgana's eyes scanned the heavy parchment, a slow, triumphant smirk spreading across her cold features. "It's an invitation. The Alpha King is hosting a royal gala. He's found his mate and commands all regional alphas and their families to attend the coronation of the new queen." Serafina sat up straight. "The king found a mate. Who is she?" "It doesn't say." Morgana dismissed with a wave. "Probably some sniveling highborn princess from the European courts. But this is our chance, Serafina. All the wealthiest, most powerful alphas in the continent will be in one room. If we play our cards right, we can secure an alliance and rebuild our fortune. The Ashford name will rise again. They clinked their glasses together, laughing in the dusty, empty study, completely unaware that the queen they were so eager to meet was the very sister they had sold for scrap. Morgana bought an emerald gown for $8,400 on credit. Serafina spent $6,900 on crimson silk. Aldrich, frail and dying, could barely protest as they spent money the family didn't have. The night of the gala arrived. The obsidian keep was transformed into a breathtaking spectacle. 10,000 candles floated above the grand ballroom, illuminating black marble floors and cascading waterfalls. 2,000 guests arrived in fleets of luxury vehicles dripping in jewels and political ambition. Among them were the Ashfords. Morgana wore her emerald gown, hair pulled back severe and tight. Serafina shimmered in crimson. Aldrich trailed behind, leaning heavily on a silver-tipped cane, looking hollow and haunted. "Stand up straight," Father Morgana hissed, slapping his arm discreetly as they handed their coats to a liveried servant. "We are representing Silver Ridge. Do not look like a beggar." The ballroom buzzed with electric anticipation. Rumors had swirled for weeks. Some said the new queen was a fierce warrior from European covens. Others whispered she was a descendant of the moon goddess herself. No one knew her name. No one had seen her face. At the stroke of midnight, a heavy resonant gong echoed through the ballroom. The music stopped abruptly. Ambient chatter died instantly as atmospheric pressure shifted, growing heavy with the unmistakable suffocating aura of the Alpha King. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as King Caspian stepped onto the grand balcony overlooking the ballroom. He was a vision of lethal elegance, dressed in a tailored, pitch-black military tunic adorned with the silver crest of the obsidian crown. The sheer power radiating from him forced every wolf on the main floor to bow their heads. "Welcome." Caspian's voice boomed, echoing without need for a microphone. "For a century, the obsidian throne has lacked its second half. Tonight, the moon goddess has answered my patience. Tonight, I present to you the heart of my empire, the white lichen, your Alpha Queen." A collective gasp rippled through thousands of attendees. From the shadows behind Caspian, she emerged. Alara stepped into the cascading light of the grand chandeliers. She was a breathtaking vision draped in a custom gown of flowing white silk and silver thread that shimmered like liquid moonlight. A delicate crown of intertwined silver branches and diamonds rested in her raven hair. But it was not the exquisite dress that commanded the room. It was her aura. Her spine was steel, her chin held high, and her eyes glowed with blinding celestial silver light. Down on the polished marble floor, Alpha Aldrich dropped his champagne flute. It shattered, the sharp crack echoing through the dead-silent ballroom. He staggered backward, clutching his chest. Morgana and Serafina froze, the blood draining from their faces until they resembled corpses. Serafina's hands trembled so violently she spilled her drink down her crimson dress. Up on the balcony, King Caspian's violet eyes locked onto the Ashford family with lethal precision. He extended his hand, leading his queen down the grand sweeping staircase. As they descended, the crowd instinctively parted, leaving the three Ashfords completely isolated in the center of the floor. Alpha Aldrich. Caspian's voice was no longer welcoming. It was a blade of pure ice. "I see you have recognized my mate." Aldrich dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Alara, my little girl, do not speak her name." Caspian snarled, the dual-toned demonic timbre of his alpha voice, forcing Aldrich into a deep, agonizing bow. Morgana, fueled by desperate delusions, stepped forward and forced a trembling smile. "Your Majesty, there is a misunderstanding. This is a joyous occasion. Our sister, the Queen, we sent her away to learn discipline. We always knew she was destined for greatness." Alara stopped at the bottom of the stairs, unlinking her arm from Caspian's. She walked slowly toward her older sister. "You always knew I was destined for greatness?" Morgana Alara asked, her voice melodic but entirely devoid of warmth. "Is that why you sold me to Ronan Ironwood for $2.3 million and a 15% stake in the Eastern Silver Mines?" "Lies," Morgana shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Alara. "She is twisting the truth." Caspian smirked, a terrifying cold expression, and snapped his fingers. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. Flanked by 4 heavily armed royal guards, a man was dragged into the light. He was wrapped in heavy silver chains, his face bruised, his arrogance entirely beaten out of him. It was Ronan Ironwood. Serafina let out a strangled sob, hiding behind her kneeling father. "Former Alpha Ironwood," Caspian commanded, "tell the High Council exactly how you acquired your lowest-ranking Omega." Ronan fell to his knees, refusing to look at Alara. "I bought her," he rasped. "Aldrich owed me a debt." Morgana and Serafina orchestrated the deal. They signed a contract offering their youngest sister as an indentured servant to clear their ledger. Beta Theron stepped forward, unrolling the heavy parchment for the entire room to see. At the bottom in thick black ink were the signatures of Morgana Serafina and Aldrich Ashford. The outrage in the room was immediate. Selling a blood relative was an abomination against the Lycan Accords. Elara looked down at the three people who had made her life a living hell. You built your luxury on my suffering. You thought because I couldn't fight back, I didn't matter. You were wrong, she turned to her father. You watched them drag me away. You let the rot in your house consume your own child. Forgive me, Aldrich choked out. I tried to protect you. The prophecy. They would have killed you if they knew you were white, Lycan. You chose fear over faith. Elara said, tears in her silver eyes, but her voice steady. You caged me to protect me, then sold me to save yourself. That is not love. The judgment is mine, Elara announced, her voice carrying the absolute authority of the obsidian crown. I strip you of your titles. Aldrich Morgana Serafina, you are no longer alphas, no longer nobility. Silver Ridge Pack is dissolved. Morgana sobbed, clawing at the marble. No, please, we have nothing. You have exactly what you gave me, Elara replied coldly. Nothing. You are banished from the northern territories. You will live as rogues. If you are found within 500 miles of our borders, my guards will shoot on sight. Elara turned her back, the ultimate gesture of dismissal, walked back up the stairs, placing her hand into Caspian's waiting palm. Remove this trash from the citadel, Theron barked. Guards dragged the weeping ruined family from the ballroom, their wails fading as heavy iron doors slammed shut. The era of their cruelty was permanently over. Elder Council representative, a female alpha of 95, stepped forward with an ancient silver crown, intricate moon phases with embedded moonstones. She placed it on Elara's head. By the authority of the High Council and the blessing of the Moon Goddess, I crown you Elara Nightshade, White Lycan Queen of the Obsidian Realm. The entire ballroom roared, long live the Queen. Orchestra swelled. Caspian pulled Elara onto the dance floor. As they waltzed, 2,000 guests watched awestruck. Is it over? Elara whispered. Can they hurt me anymore? Caspian's arms tightened around her. It's over. You're safe. You're queen. You're mine. She rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady, strong, eternal. The Obsidian Realm had transformed. The Omega Protection Act was signed into law. Trafficking, and slavery now carried automatic death penalty. 15 corrupt pacts were dissolved territories redistributed to victims. Ironwood Fortress became a rehabilitation center, housing 327 survivors in its first year, funded by $4.2 million in seized Ashford assets. Ronan Ironwood was executed in March. Marta sentenced to life in Blackgate Prison. Morgana and Serafina lived in a rogue camp on the Canadian border, selling scavenged goods, sleeping in tents. One evening, Serafina was seen begging for food at a packed border turned away. Morgana, bitter, told her sister, "We had a palace. We threw it away for pride." Aldrich died 4 months post-banishment, his wasting illness finally claiming him. When Elara received the news, she felt empty. Do you want to attend the funeral? Caspian asked. No, Elara said quietly. He died the day he signed that contract. On a warm summer evening, Elara stood before the High Council, 8 months pregnant, glowing with health and power. I was born privileged, but raised in chains, she told the assembled alphas. I've seen both sides of our world, the marble floors and the dirt cellars. The Obsidian Realm will change. Every pack must hold elections every 5 years. Alphas no longer rule by birth alone, they must earn their people's loyalty. Omegas will have legal representation. Trafficking will be met with execution. The age of the strong devouring the weak is over. Standing ovation. Even conservative alphas applauded. That night, 9 months pregnant, Elara returned to Oregon with Caspian and an honor guard. She visited the rebuilt Ashford estate, now Ashford Memorial Sanctuary, run by Harrison the guard, who had once arrested her. Your Majesty, Harrison bowed deeply. Thank you for giving us a second chance. You were following orders, Elara said, but you never hurt me more than necessary. That mattered. She toured her old attic room, now a memorial to fallen Omegas. Her childhood drawings still hung on the wall wolves she'd sketched at age 7 before suppression. She broke down crying, processing her trauma fully for the first time. Caspian held her. You're allowed to grieve the childhood they stole. Under the full moon, Elara shifted into her white lichen form, even pregnant, magnificent. She stood on a ridge overlooking the Oregon forests where she had once suffered. She raised her muzzle and howled, melodic, powerful, echoing across every territory. All across North America, 12,000 miles away, wolves stopped and listened. Former captives in rehabilitation centers heard it, felt hope. Corrupt alphas in hiding heard it, felt dread. Children in safe packs heard it, felt inspired. Caspian's black wolf joined her, howling in harmony. 2 wolves silhouetted against the full moon, her white fur glowing silver, his black fur haloed in violet. Ilara's voice echoed in the wind. They tried to break me in a cellar. They tried to erase me with cruelty. But you cannot extinguish a wolf's spirit. You can only teach it to burn brighter. I am Ilara Nightshade, White Lichen Queen of the Obsidian Realm. I am the voice of the voiceless, the shield of the vulnerable, the end of the old order. This is not just my story. This is the story of every soul who survived. The age of suffering and silence is over. The white wolf has risen, and her reign has only just begun.